Well, we have been invited to observe a Holy Lent. Those are the classical words that the church uses as we start these 40 days that lead us up to Easter, that lead us through a time of self-reflection, a time of self-examination, a time when traditionally we have made choices, sometimes of things we give up, sometimes of things we take on, sometimes of particular practices that we incorporate into our lives. I won't ask you to raise your hand, but sometimes I think we make a good commitment on Ash Wednesday, and maybe by the first Sunday of Lent, we've already lost our practice. We've already forgotten what it was we said we'd do. We've already dropped it. And it feels to me like sometimes what happens is that we treat this Lenten journey, we treat these choices as if they were our opportunity to once again make a good New Year's resolution. That maybe we had hoped to do something in January and we've run out of steam. And so now here we come, the end of winter, moving into the springtime, and we think, okay, I'm going to try one more time. Maybe there's something I can give up. Maybe there's something I can take on that will make me a little more holy, that will help me be a little more who I want to be, who I think God wants me to be. And when we turn Lent into just our list of our greatest hopes and our greatest wishes, I think we miss the point. For the point isn't about how well we can make it through a practice for 40 days. The point isn't about how self-disciplined we can be, whether we can really make it without coffee, whether we can survive one more day without chocolate, whether we can spend one more hour in prayer, whatever we've taken on and identified as our practice for that time. No, what we're being invited to is a deeper relationship with God. A deeper relationship with God. We're invited not to try to follow some 10-step plan, but to open our hearts and allow our lives to be shaped by the very Spirit of God in an intentional kind of way. You see, we shape our lives in the Christian faith and in the practices of the Christian church around the life of Jesus. And so the seasons that we celebrate, the holidays we celebrate, the practices that we're a part of are to open us to ever more grow in having our lives shaped by the very Spirit and life of Jesus. And so when we pause at this moment for Lent, when we pause at this time when the days are lengthening, when we pause to set aside these 40 days, what we're pausing to do is to invite the very Spirit of God to sustain and shape us, just as the Spirit of God sustained and shaped Jesus during those 40 days that he spent in the wilderness as he started his own ministry. You remember what had happened? Jesus had been baptized. The Spirit had come upon him in a way that those around heard the words, "This is my beloved Son, with whom I'm well pleased." And now, as if before the waters of baptism can even dry, Jesus finds himself in the wilderness for 40 days and 40 nights, a time of self-examination, a time of discerning who God has called him to be and what his ministry would look like, how it would be shaped, what would mark his life. You see, that's the tricky part about temptation, is we often talk about temptation as being trying to avoid something bad, but bad things aren't tempting. What's tempting is something that we can justify, something that we can say, oh, maybe that makes sense. Oh, I can explain why I would go that way. Oh, I can make that work. That's what's tempting to us, are the things that we can rationalize, that we can justify, that we can say, this would work in my plan for the world. This would work in my way of approaching life. But sometimes what is tempting to us is tempting because it is solely our plan. And so what Jesus spent his time doing and what we spend our time doing during this season of Lent is saying what makes sense in God's way of being in the world. So let's pause a moment and just think about the temptations that Jesus himself faced. Now, he spent 40 days and 40 nights, and so at the end of that 40 days, he's hungry. And so the first temptation is, turn these stones into bread. We know you're famished. Turn them into bread. Take care of your immediate need. Do something that would help your needs be met. Use your power to serve yourself. And then there's this temptation to jump off a pinnacle, to do something dramatic, to do something exciting. I had somebody say to me one time, Jesus needed a better PR person, they said. They said on Easter, he really needed somebody who was saying, see, we told you so. See, I told you so. I told you who I was. I told you I was the one with power. I told you that. That's what that temptation to jump off the pinnacle is about, is to say, be the dramatic one. Be the one who has people look at you and say, wow. Be the one who uses your power to impress, to overwhelm, to awe, but for all the wrong reasons, to point solely to yourself, rather than to the sustaining grace of God that you're bringing to the world. And then there's that third temptation, a temptation to be the ruler of all the nations. Just worship me, the tempter says, and I'll give you everything. Again, that invitation to take power and to manipulate it to be for our good, to be for our purposes. And what Jesus resists is that temptation to form his ministry into the images of the world, and instead says, no, who I am is Son of God. Son of God who points beyond myself and points to the very Spirit of God that's accompanied him to the wilderness, that's accompanied him into this time of temptation, who has gone with him and sustained him and is still present with him. For Jesus' ministry is to point us to the God who calls us to acts of mercy, acts of justice, acts of love and kindness, to be those who walk humbly with God and with each other. And so no matter how good, no matter how tempting, no matter how convincing it might have been to use that power, to use his ministry, to use his opportunities, to do the splashy, to do the wonderful, to draw attention to himself, Jesus understands that he's about calling people's attention beyond themselves, beyond him to God's work in the world, to God's claim on all of our lives, on God's intentions for all humanity, for all creation. It's an amazing story that tells us about temptation in our own life. For the temptation that we have is to think we're supposed to have it all together, and that we're supposed to live in a way that others are impressed with us, that others see us and say, oh, wow, they've got it together. They know what they're about. And yet the call for us isn't to be strong. The call for us is to be faithful, to be responsive, to be those who live in a way that point beyond us, to live in a way that says we know who we are. We know whose we are. And we've heard it in recent weeks, haven't we? We've heard who we are. We've heard those words that said, through the waters of baptism, you are the beloved. We've heard those words of Jesus where he says, you're the salt of the earth. You're the light of the world. We've heard those words that say, you are forgiven. You are forgiven. Do we hear and rest in those words that tell us who and whose we are? That's what this season is about, is claiming again God's claim on our lives, drawing nearer in every way we know to open ourselves to the fullness of God's grace. For temptations will come for us and will come to us just as they came to Jesus. And they will look justifiable and they will look like something we need to tend to. They will start just as Jesus' words of temptation started. Since you're the Son of God, or if you're the Son of God, since you have this power, since you have this opportunity, who are you going to be now? Who are you going to be in this life? Someone said it like this: temptations come to us in moments when we look at others and feel insecure about not having enough. Temptation comes in judgments we make about strangers or friends who make choices we do not understand. Temptation rules us, making us unable to look away from those in need and to live our lives unaffected by poverty, hunger, and disease. Temptation rages in moments when we allow our tempter to define our lives, or when our addiction to wealth or power, influence over another, vanity, or an inordinate need for control defines who we are. Temptation wins when we engage in the justification of a little lie, of small sins, a racist joke, a questionable business practice for the greater good, a criticism of a spouse or partner when he or she's not around. Temptation wins when we get so caught up in the trappings of life that we lose sight of life itself. Oh, temptations will come to us, and they will invite us to be other than who we are. They will invite us to be those who solve things quickly, who try to avoid the mess, who try to use power to coerce, instead of understanding that we are those called and claimed by God for a purpose far beyond our own. To point through our lives to the mercy of God's grace. To point through our lives in the way that God is working with us. To point with our lives to the one who knew temptation and who chose the way of grace, of mercy instead. You see, temptations will come to us saying, well, since you're a child of God, if you're a child of God, couldn't you justify this? Couldn't you get away with this? Wouldn't it be all right to expect God to keep you out of the mess? Wouldn't it be all right to ask for God to give you a little power so you wouldn't be vulnerable? Wouldn't it be all right to say, I did it for you, Lord. Can I get a little glory? And the response is, oh yes, you are a child of God. You know who you are. You know whose you are. You know your calling. You know you are beloved. You know you are forgiven. You know you are the salt of the earth and the light of the world. You know you are mine. And the God of all creation, made known to us in Jesus Christ, walks with us and empowers us and leads us and shapes us, that we grow ever more into his likeness, knowing we do not walk alone.